Hi everybody and welcome to IT 604 IT Project Management. In this session 3, we're going to talk about the project charter and project and product scope management. But first, let's review our project lifecycle. Depending on the method that an organization chooses, our project lifecycle runs in 5 phases: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. In the planning phase, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing can repeat. Throughout all 5 phases, we manage project scope, quality, schedule, budget, resources, risk, and people. And that's a whole lot to manage. In our previous module, we also discussed the nature of a business case. Essentially, a business case answers the question of why an organization should invest into a project. Here is how a business case comes about. First, a core team of engineers and of managers and of senior executives is selected to define the measurable organizational value that is needed from a specific project or program. Then alternatives are being identified and evaluated on the basis of cost and feasibility. We've seen a couple of mathematical models for that, such as net present value. And that also includes defining the total cost and the benefit of ownership of the product or service that is the outcome of a project. Then a panel of decision makers will weigh several business cases for competing projects against one another and choose the highest ranking projects in terms of their promise of measurable organizational value. From there originates the project charter that formalizes the execution of that business case. So there is a direct traceability between the charter of a project, which is the contract between an organization and the project manager as the one who gets to execute on that project, and the organization itself that has defined the business case. This is also, as you can see in the green document icon here, why the business case is part of the project charter template, right next to the project description, because the business case justifies the existence of the project. Other parts of the project charter are the scope definition, namely what's in and out of scope, the goals and the success metrics, along with the assumptions that the project manager can make about the work environment, and the constraints, that is the limits that will direct how project work can be executed, the risks, the budget, the preliminary schedule for the project, and then the available resources. But most importantly, let's remember that a project does not exist if the project charter has not been signed by the project sponsor. The project sponsor signature is absolutely vital in order to not just authorize the existence of the project, but to authorize the powers of the project manager to go forth and to spend the allocated budget for the project. Now, a project charter can come to the project manager through the business case. It also can come down from an external company if you're working for a consulting organization through a statement of work, meaning a statement of work defines what an external customer is expecting for their funding, and this statement of work often comes to a project manager who is outsourced that way, together with a project charter that will contain exactly the same information as a project charter that comes down through a business case. Last week we also looked at how the PMBOK project phases, initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing, coincide with the major guiding project knowledge area called project integration. And in the initiating phase, in which the business case is being transformed into the project charter, this is where the project integration knowledge area takes its beginnings, and once the project charter has been developed with or without the help of the project manager, but still always owned by the project sponsor, the project manager, upon the sponsor's signature, can take off running and develop the project management plan, direct and manage project work, manage project knowledge, monitor and control the project work to make sure everything is on target, and then perform integrated change control so that neither scope nor schedule nor budget can change without any change request, which is a formalized change management process to ensure that our triple constraints are always in harmony. And then, of course, closing the project or the phase. So let's take a look at where we are in the project planning framework. In the last session, we talked about the business case or the statement of work that define the measurable organizational value for a project, which is then codified and formalized in the project charter. This leads us to a detailed scope description, namely the scope statement, which is derived from the in-scope and out-of-scope description that is contained in the project charter. This scope statement leads us to project requirements, technical requirements, use cases, user stories, all of those things, depending on the project methodology that is in use at the organization. Once we have the scope statement and the project requirements, we can think about how to develop the schedule for the project, and that includes selecting the appropriate project structure, which can be waterfall for smaller projects, which can be any kind of iterative formats for larger projects, from a Scrum format to a Kanban format to anything in between, any hybrid waterfall iterative format as well, depending on organizational preferences. In order to develop these phases and include tasks into these phases to end up with an actual project schedule, we're going to have to define what these tasks are, then sequence these tasks, identify resources who are going to execute on these tasks, and then develop time estimates based on the resources skill set and their availability that will allow us to come up with a good schedule, and that will allow us from the schedule then to develop the project budget. Once we are done with both schedule and budget, we are going to start off the project execution phase, because we are ready to start tracking to the schedule and the budget once they have been approved by, you guessed it, the project sponsor. Let's take an in-depth look at the project charter. Let's take an in-depth look at the project charter then. The PMBOK defines the project charter as a document that formally authorizes the existence of a project and provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to project activities. Organizational resources, of course, means first of all project funding and also project resources as such. So the project charter essentially defines scope, quality, schedule, budget, resources, risk, and everything in between that has to do with the management of an IT project, and that has to do with the management of people. This also means it really is the expectation setting authorized contract between the organization and you, the project manager. And once that contract has been signed by the project sponsor, you have been authorized to lead the project and to perform to the targets that are set out there for you. These targets have been derived from the measurable organizational value that has come down to the project charter from the business case. I've said previously that a project really does not exist without a project charter. And the project manager is really not a project manager until the project charter for his or her project has been signed by the project sponsor. Is that true? Yes and no. There are projects that are run without project charters. And if we remember what we looked at in our first module of this course, namely the numbers that have been published by the Standish Group in the Chaos Report, where about 2/3 of all projects have continued to fail, we understand that some of these projects, in fact the majority of these projects, probably were run without project charters, because we have seen lack of engagement by senior management and by users and by stakeholders in the outcome of a project, for example. We have seen changing requirements and no formally set targets for project performance. We have seen people problems, technology problems just a little bit, but mostly problems with clarity and clear project boundaries as the major sources for project failure. A project charter addresses all of these points. It defines a project start, it defines project boundaries, it sets out project risks that need to be managed in order for the project to be more likely to succeed. Also, a project charter establishes a formal record of the project so that we have a baseline against which we can process changes with a well-defined change management process. And a project charter commits senior management to an interest in the successful execution of a project. So this means that all of the questions that you're seeing in the lower half of this slide really address the clarification and the expectations that are wrapped around a project and that can serve either as a basis for communication and discussion and negotiation, or once accepted and signed, as the plan of record to go forward and execute. And while the project manager is the one to execute the project based on the project charter, he or she really does not own it. The one stakeholder who owns the project charter and where the buck essentially stops in the execution of the project is always the project sponsor. The project sponsor is the political powerhouse for championing your project within the organization, and he or she is also the person who has control over the funding of your project. Hence, the project charter itself is owned by the project sponsor and not by the project manager. In our previous module, we've already looked at the major components of the project charter. So now let's focus on the middle third. The middle third comes right after the first part that defines the project governance and that shows all the authorization signatures. And this middle part goes into the meat of the project itself. The project description is a short 2 or 3 sentence description of the goals of the project and of the problem that it is designed to solve, or the opportunity that it is designed to address. That is followed by the business case, a short statement that summarizes the business case which decision makers used in order to determine the feasibility and the implementation readiness of this project. From the project description is derived an in-scope and out-of-scope section. In the in-scope section, we define specifically what it is that the project is supposed to deliver. That includes a detailed description of the product or service and what it is designed to do. And it also includes a specific description of what it is not designed to do. It is important that we define not just what is in scope for the project, but that we also define what is out of scope for the project. When we do that, this will prevent us from falling prey to what is called scope creep, in which scope is not defined clearly enough such that a client or an internal manager or executive can approach a project manager and say, oh, while you are building ABC, can you also quickly build XYZ? I think it fits into your project. And at this point, it's important for a project manager to whip out the in-scope, out-of-scope definition and review the feasibility of the new request. And if the new request is not part of the in-scope and out-of-scope description, then the answer to that will always be, let's review the extra work that this will generate, and let's make sure that we evaluate its impact on budget and schedule. So the in-scope and out-of-scope section is the basis for an even more detailed scope statement, which also goes then into direct project design and product design. Underneath the business case, we find the description of the project goals and objectives and the key success metrics. These are the targets that were set in the measurable organizational value description within the business case. Before we go any further, it's really important we understand what project and product scope really means. In this part of our module, we want to understand the 5 processes that support project scope management as defined by PMI and the PMBOK guide. And we also want to understand the difference between product scope and project scope. Lastly, we want to learn how to apply several tools and techniques for defining and managing the project scope. Being directly derived from a project's measurable organizational value, project scope sets out the work boundaries and the deliverables of a project so that what needs to get done will get done, but only that and nothing else. So in other words, project scope defines all the work and all the activities and all the deliverables that the project team needs to provide in order for the project to achieve its intended measurable organizational value. How is scope documented? Scope is often documented as part of the work in the work breakdown structure. And that is our goal at the end of this module. A work breakdown structure then is a documentation of how work can be organized in order to achieve project scope. The work breakdown structure is essentially a project management tool that gives us a hierarchical structure for the work that needs to be done in order to connect a project scope with its detailed work plan that we can create later on. There are, in fact, 2 types of scope, the project-oriented scope and the product-oriented scope. The project-oriented scope spans the entire life cycle of the project, from initiation to closing. The project-oriented scope contains items such as the project charter, the project schedule, the project budget, project lessons learned, and all the kind of administrative documentation that is part of managing a project successfully. Typically, the project-oriented scope is documented in a deliverable structure chart. The product-oriented scope is focused specifically on the technical output that the project is supposed to deliver. As such, the product-oriented scope is documented in a feature document, in a software requirements specification, typically also in a number of use case diagrams that describe exactly how specific actors, people, or other systems are going to interact with our system in order to model the system boundaries. So the product-oriented scope, which is typically used within the execution phase in our software development lifecycle, the SDLC, is a subset of or is an asset in the project-oriented scope. The product-oriented scope is a part of it. In order to complete a project in IT successfully, we need both. We need the project-oriented scope with all the administrative documentation, and we need the product-oriented scope that documents exactly our product architecture. This graphic does a great job of putting into context the relationship between project scope and product scope. Now, to remind ourselves, project scope, here shown in the blue rectangle, is the work that we need to accomplish in order to deliver the product, service, or result that the project intends, with the specified features and the functions that the project intends, in order to build and deliver the measurable organizational value that we're supposed to deliver. Much of project scope management happens in the planning and in the monitoring and controlling phases. This starts with planning the scope management, collecting requirements, defining the scope, as well as then taking the requirements and that scope definition to figure out what the work is that needs to occur in order to deliver that scope. This is what is involved in the create work breakdown structure, or create WBS stage here. And then in the monitoring and controlling phases, of course, we're going to validate our scope, which means we're testing whether we have built the right thing and whether we have built what we have built correctly. And then we're also, of course, always controlling the scope in order to determine that we're building only what is in scope and not what is out of scope, based on the scope definition in our project charter. Now, in the planning phase for project scope, some of the assets that we produce are the deliverable definition table, or the deliverable structure chart, and the work breakdown structure, or the WBS. And in the monitoring and controlling phases, we have our scope change control process that has a lot to do, of course, with our overall project change control mechanisms from our project integration knowledge area. So then we have our product scope, which is here shown in the white rectangle. Our product scope comprises the features and the functions that characterize our product, service, or result, which means those would be the technical requirements. This would be our product design in terms of a context diagram, for example, that shows the data flow, or in terms of a use case diagram that shows how actors interact with our system to determine what functionality we need to build in order to deliver these desired actions. In order to verify our product scope, we use test plans, specifically verification cross-reference matrices called VCRMs, that determine whether we have built a product that actually works as intended. Yeah, so let's talk about scope creep. In order to produce a project's measurable organizational value, we typically have what we call a balance between scope, schedule, and budget, meaning we have determined what we're going to build, and based on that amount of functionality that we are going to build, we have estimated a budget that we are going to use to pay for the generation of this scope. And based on the budget and the scope and the people that we have available, we have built a schedule that will allow us to finish building this scope, and only this scope, on time and within this budget. Now, of course, there will be cases where somebody will approach you, maybe an executive, maybe another very influential person in an organization, to say, hey, while you are building ABC, could you just also build me XYZ? It really isn't that much extra work. That would mean that our scope would increase, but what would not increase would be the budget or the schedule, which means that we would have to do more than intended with the same budget and the same schedule. And that introduces an imbalance into this triple constraint on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, it means that we are going to introduce a risk to our budget management and to our schedule management. So the only correct answer to this is that sure, we can build you XYZ while we're building ABC, but we're going to first have to evaluate the impact on our budget and on our schedule. And then we're going to put together a change request in order to adjust our scope so that we can ask for any extra funding or for any extra schedule that it will take to complete the project on time. That is the typical acceptable way of introducing extra scope into your project. In other words, it takes an approved scope change management process in order to adjust scope so that budget and schedule can also be adjusted. And these change requests have to be authorized by the project sponsor. A change request is an addition to the project charter and modifies parts of the project charter. So here, if scope is increased, it modifies the scope statement as it is recorded in the project charter. This is why any changes to scope and to budget and to schedule will have to be authorized by the project sponsor first before they can be implemented. Here we are looking at the project scope management knowledge area as defined by PMI and the PMBOK, and how these activities and these processes are distributed among the big process groups of initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling. And we're seeing here that scope management activities and then scope verification and controlling activities, those are the last two, really happen in the planning and in the monitoring and controlling phases. We can also see how they are aligned with requirements and design of the SDLC, specifically in a waterfall alignment here, and how scope validation is aligned with the test stage of the software development lifecycle, and of course controlling the scope is aligned with any of these phases through the implementation stage. Here is a great overview of all the processes of project scope management. Please pause this video here and read through this list. As I have mentioned before, the project scope statement really is an expanded version of the scope statement as it is located in the project charter. That's because the scope statement and the project charter have to be traceable from one to the next. The project scope statement also contains a deliverable definition table or a deliverable structure chart that contains the assets that need to be generated throughout the project scope. And then here in our case contains a context diagram and a use case diagram, both of which address the technical product scope, since the product scope is a major part of the entire project scope. Lastly, the scope statement also needs to include a reference to the scope change management process or a description of the scope change management process in itself. That's important in order to avoid scope creep and in order to show the correct way of adjusting project scope should change requests and the change request process be needed. Here we're seeing two ways of documenting project scope. On the left side, you're seeing a deliverable definitions table. The deliverable definitions table contains the project deliverable, here for example, project charter and project plan, and so on. The structure of that specific deliverable, in our case it's all documents. then the approval structure in alignment to our project governance structure, and the resources required, that is, the roles that are in charge of producing this kind of deliverable. Now, please note that in this project deliverable definition table, we also see the product scope. For example, requirements, physical design, and logical design. That is because product scope is part of project scope. And we're seeing the same thing in a different structure on the right side of the screen in a deliverable structure chart. The deliverable structure chart is a hierarchical model in which we're seeing the 5 project phases on the first level of the tree. And we're seeing here in the white rectangles the specific deliverables to the individual project phases, and then we're seeing under execution and monitoring and controlling the deliverables that are aligned with the software development lifecycle of analysis, design, build, test, and implementation. And this is another way of showing all the deliverables that are required for a project. In other words, here we're seeing the project deliverables on the first level of the tree, and then the software development lifecycle deliverables on the second part of the tree, the second tier of the tree. But all of these are required in order to fulfill the entire project scope. Now, going into product scope, which is, as we have seen, a subset of the entire project scope, we are looking at, for example, software requirements. Here on the left side, we're seeing 3 levels of software requirements, starting from business requirements that then lead to the generation of the business case and the project charter, to the use case documentation, then that leads to the functional requirements, that is the requirements of how the software or how the product or service is supposed to function. That includes system requirements, quality attributes, and then that leads to the software requirement specification, in which each software module is described exactly based on the functional requirements that are being passed down through the use case documentation, and that also take into account the necessity of interfacing with external applications through APIs and any other constraints in terms of operating environment, operating systems, and so on. So as we're looking at the green rectangle, namely the scope as it is documented in our business case and in our charter, at this level, this is where our project scope statement lives. Our project scope statement then specifically contains the product scope statement part that consists of a context diagram that we're seeing on the top right hand. The context diagram shows us here, for example, with an e-commerce banking system, the data flow and the ways in which information goes from one module or from one external system to the actual system that we are supposed to be delivering. A second way of documenting the project functionality, in addition to the context diagram, please note that in a context diagram the system is always shown in a circle, is the use case diagram. In the use case diagram, in contrast to the context diagram, our system is always shown in a rectangle, and we have these little mannequin figures that are called actors, and either humans interacting with our system and performing specific activities on our system, as we can see in those ovals that are connected to the little mannequins, or they are other systems that interface with our banking system through APIs, and those interfaces and interface activities are also documented in rectangles. Both of these together, the context diagram and the use case, or a whole number of use cases for any kind of interaction that actors have with our system, typically that's an entire database full of use cases, make it possible to develop a detailed design and a software requirements specification that we can then pass on to our development team in order to build for us the e-commerce banking system as designed based on user requirements, business rules, system requirements, business requirements, and quality attributes, all of which lead us to these two or more diagrams that then allow us to be very specific in the documentation of the code that needs to be written. Here is another look at a use case diagram. As we have seen before, the system itself is always shown in a rectangle in a use case, and then we have our actors outside of our rectangle because they interact with the system. Actors can be people such as a customer or a manager, but they can also be external systems as shown here, an ERP system, for example. The activities that our actors perform on the system are shown as ovals, or are shown inside of ovals inside of our rectangle. They are always connected with the actor who performs these actions. Here, for example, our customer wants to view check images, change the address, get branch information, and so on. Our manager wants to print reports, and our ERP system, in order to process data further, wants to get account information for a customer, we're going to assume, and then update account balances. We have just discussed the entire path of scope definition from the initial scope statements as shown in the project charter all the way down to the software requirements specification in which every single little software module is expressly defined. That is one way of looking at scope, but how do you know whether you're not losing your way somewhere in there? This is where the validate scope process comes in at the end of our development process, because in order to determine whether we have built the right thing and we have fulfilled all of our scope items that we set out to build, we need to validate each one of these items. This includes verifying all of the MOV. In other words, has the project's MOV been clearly defined and agreed upon such that we have built the right thing? Have all deliverables been properly documented? This means, do we have a software requirement specification? Do we have an architectural diagram? Can we trace back the code that we have written to an item in the diagram? And do all items that we have built support the project's measurable organizational value as originally described? Part of validating the scope then are also the quality standards. Namely, are controls in place to help us determine that the work that we have done was done based on specific quality standards, based on specific legal requirements, and so on. And then, of course, since we're validating not just product scope through testing, but we're also validating project scope, we need to validate that all milestones have been defined in the project delivery cycle and that all milestones have been agreed upon as well and approved by the project sponsor. Lastly, we need to always make sure within the validate scope process, which is not just something that happens at the end of our build and our design and build phase, but really that happens throughout the entire project life cycle. We always need to check back with our stakeholders that everybody knows exactly what to expect during the entire development cycle. Because when expectations are unclear or not aligned between the project team and external stakeholders, then scope creep can occur. We've already talked about scope creep as that request of, oh, while you're building ABC, can you also build XYZ for me? Now here is the actual change request process that needs to occur in order to add scope XYZ to the already agreed upon and documented scope ABC. Because any kind of requested change adds on to the project charter. As such, we need what is called a scope change request form, which is what you're seeing here, in which the impacts of any change requests on schedule, on resources required, that includes people's work time, and on project budgets are being evaluated. And then a recommendation is given. And this scope change request form, which can be on paper, it can be electronic, then has to be authorized, and it has to be authorized as a supplement to the project charter because it modifies the project charter. So the only person who can authorize a scope change request has to be the project sponsor. No scope changes without project sponsor approval. And because each change request is a modification to the project charter, we need to log all the scope change requests with the request number, the request title, and the date, the priority, whether that scope change request was approved, when we expect it to be approved, and who approved it. That's very, very important because remember, any change request is a modification not just to project scope as stated in the project charter, but it is also a modification of the project budget, and more often than not, a scope change request also will extend your project schedule. So we're at the end of our module on project scope management. Please take a look at the vocabulary that you're seeing here and make sure you know how to define and explain each of these words. And I'm really excited to see you for our next module when we move from our project scope definition to the work breakdown structure.